Well, good evening, everybody. Welcome to Shakespeare and Company. Thank you all for turning out on this rather rainy April day. We are delighted to welcome Reni Eddo-Lodge to Shakespeare and Company tonight. Sometimes a book comes along that manages not just to capture a moment, but to catalyse a movement. Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race by Reni Eddo-Lodge is such a book. An exposition of structural racism and its effects that is both authoritative and personal. Since its publication last year, Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race hasn't so much provoked a debate as performed the long overdue task of redefining the very terms upon which the debate is conducted. As Reni writes in the preface, it's about not just the explicit side, but the slippery side of racism. The bits that are hard to define and the bits that make you doubt yourself. It's also about history and systems and privilege and feminism and class and the media. And if you haven't read the book yet and are wondering how they all link up, then you won't be wondering by the time you finish. In a new chapter written for the paperback edition entitled Aftermath, Reni Eddo-Lodge writes, "My initial aim with the book was simple. I wanted to change the national conversation about race." We might disagree on quite how simple an ambition that was, but there's no questioning that she has achieved it with this book. Reni Eddo-Lodge is an award-winning journalist who has written for the New York Times, The Voice, Daily Telegraph, Guardian, Independent, among many other publications. She's the winner of a Woman of the World Bold Moves Award, an MHP 30 to Watch Award, and was chosen as one of the top 30 young people in digital media by The Guardian. She has also been listed in Elle's 100 Inspirational Women's list and The Roots 30 Black Viral Voices Under 30, and contributed to the best-selling anthology The Good Immigrant. Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race is her first book. It won the 2018 Jalak Prize, was chosen as Non-Fiction Book of the Year by both Foyles and Blackwells, was longlisted for the Baillie Gifford Prize and shortlisted for the British Books Awards Non-Fiction Narrative Book of the Year and Books in My Bag Readers Award for Non-Fiction. Reni Eddo-Lodge is also the writer and presenter of the brand new podcast About Race, which continues a conversation where this book leaves off. Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race was called A Book That Was Begging to Be Written by Marlon James, and a wake-up call to a nation in denial by The Observer. Please join me in welcoming Reni Eddo-Lodge to Shakespeare and Company.
Thank you. That was a good intro. That was very up-to-date.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah. Where did you get the info from? Because Wikipedia is late. Wikipedia is old.
From many different sources.
Okay, well done. I just have to say, top-quality journalism there. Yes, it was a big ambition to try and change Britain's conversation about race. Was it a big ambition? Well, actually, it was like something that I was like a dog with a bone for many, many years on this. So for me, it was very simple. But it was also very difficult because, there was many different obstacles. So I think the first thing that I'm going to do, first off, thank you everybody for being here today. I've got a bit of a cold at the moment, so I might sneeze. Just bear with me, roll with me on that. I'm going to read you the blog post that I wrote 4 years ago. Just over 4 years ago now, February 2014. And it was written, I was very much involved in activism at the time, feminist activism in particular. I wasn't having the best time, as you'll be able to tell from this original blog post. So I'm going to read that to you. Because it's what I always read. I almost know it off by heart now. Okay. I'm no longer engaging with white people on the topic of race. Not all white people, just the vast majority who refuse to accept the legitimacy of structural racism and its symptoms. I can no longer engage with the gulf of an emotional disconnect that white people display when a person of colour articulates their experience. You can see their eyes shut down and harden. It's like treacle is poured into their ears, blocking up their ear canals. It's like they can no longer hear us. This emotional disconnect is a conclusion of living a life oblivious to the fact that their skin colour is the norm and all others deviate from it. At best, white people have been taught not to mention that people of colour are different in case it offends us. They truly believe that the experiences of their life as a result of their skin colour can and should be universal. I just can't engage with the bewilderment and the defensiveness as they try to grapple with the fact that not everyone experiences the world in the way that they do. They've never had to think about what it means, in power terms, to be white. So anytime they're vaguely reminded of this fact, they interpret it as an affront. Their eyes glaze over in boredom or widen in indignation. Their mouths start twitching as they get defensive. Their throats open up as they try to interrupt, itching to talk over you but not really listen because they need to let you know that you've got it wrong. The journey towards understanding structural racism still requires people of colour to prioritise white feelings. Even if they can hear you, they're not really listening. It's like something happens to the words as they leave our mouths and reach their ears. The words hit a barrier of denial and they don't get any further. That's the emotional disconnect. It's not really surprising, because they've never known what it means to embrace a person of colour as a true equal with thoughts and feelings that are as valid as their own. Watching The Colour of Fear by Lin-Manuel, I saw people of colour break down in tears as they struggled to convince a defiant white man that his words were enforcing and perpetuating a white racist standard on them. All the while, he stared obliviously, completely confused by this pain. At best, trivialising it, at worst, ridiculing it. I've written before about this white denial being the ubiquitous politics of race that operates on its inherent invisibility. So I can't talk to white people about race anymore because of the consequent denials, awkward cartwheels, and mental acrobatics that they display when this is brought to their attention. Who really wants to be alerted to a structural system that benefits them at the expense of others? I can no longer have this conversation because we're often coming at it from completely different places. I can't have a conversation with them about the details of a problem if they don't even recognise that the problem exists. Worse still is the white person who might be willing to entertain the possibility of said racism, but who thinks we enter the conversation as equals. We don't. Not to mention that entering into conversation with defiant white people is frankly a dangerous task for me. As the heckles rise and the defiance grows, I have to tread incredibly carefully, because if I express frustration, anger, or exasperation at their refusal to understand, they will tap into their presubscribed racist tropes about angry black people who are a threat to them and their safety. It's very likely that they'll then paint me as a bully or an abuser. It's also likely that their white friends will rally round them, rewrite history, and make the lies the truth. Trying to engage with them and navigate their racism is not worth that. Amid every conversation about nice white people feeling silenced by conversations about race, there's a sort of ironic and glaring lack of understanding, or empathy, for those of us who have been visibly marked out as different for our entire lives and live the consequences. It's truly a lifetime of self-censorship that people of colour have to live. The options are, speak your truth and face the reprisal, or bite your tongue and get ahead in life. It must be a strange life, always having permission to speak and feeling indignant when you're finally asked to listen. It's down from white people's never questioned entitlement, I suppose. I cannot continue to emotionally exhaust myself trying to get this message across, while also towing a very precarious line that tries not to implicate any one white person in their role of perpetuating structural racism, lest they character assassinate me. So I'm no longer talking to white people about race. I don't have a huge amount of power to change the way the world works, but I can set boundaries. I can halt the entitlement they feel towards me, and I'll start that by stopping the conversation. The balance is too far swung in their favour. Their intent is often not to listen or learn, but to exert their power, to prove me wrong, to emotionally drain me, and to rebalance the status quo. I'm not talking to white people about race unless I absolutely have to. If there's something like a media or conference appearance that means that someone might hear what I'm saying and feel less alone, then I'll participate. But I'm no longer dealing with white people who don't want to hear it, wish to ridicule it, and frankly, don't deserve it.
Thank you. That sentence that came just towards the end of the blog post. I don't have a huge amount of power to change the way the world works, but I can set boundaries.
Yes.
4 years after you wrote that blog post, and what it's led on to with this, the writing of the book, and the sensation in a way that the book has become. Did you have any sense of when you wrote that sentence of how powerful setting boundaries could be?
No, for me it was a very personal boundary. You know, I'm somebody who's been writing diaries for my entire life and writing on the internet in blogging form since I was like 13 or something. So, you know, I wrote that on my blog that nobody was reading. and I was just like declaring my own personal boundary, really. And the thing was that my blog was linked to my Twitter. And so when I press publish, that also went out on my Twitter. So I was just setting my personal boundary, and you know what writing's like. I don't know if anybody else in here writes. Writing is almost a way of like setting your intentions, holding yourself accountable. So that's what I did, and I knew it was my boundary. I didn't think that anybody else was. It's not that I didn't think anyone was going to read it, because you write on the internet, you hope somebody listens, but rather it was just really how I was deeply feeling at the time, and I just was blindsided by the amount of people who read that and then also suggested to me that they were feeling exactly the same way. But that was a very personal boundary, and it was also something that I felt very much alone in dealing with. While I was involved in various activist groups, I would talk about it with them, but we were on the margins. So yeah, and I suppose the weird thing about setting that personal boundary was that the opposite has happened. But at least I'm now speaking about race on my own terms, rather than being sort of like dragged into these pointless, destructive, wildly unbalanced conversations where I'm put on the spot and told to justify myself, which I think happens a lot when people try to speak up about racial inequality. The general consensus is that that's not a problem, prove it. So I wrote the book to prove it.
and one of those ways of speaking about it on your own terms, I think, as well, is the concentrating a big chunk of the beginning of the book to history, to the history of black people in Britain, which is. When I picked up the book, I was surprised to find at first, just looking at the contents, that there was sort of like this first quarter dedicated to Black British history. But it becomes very clear very quickly the importance of understanding and indeed just knowing that history to the direction that the book is going to take.
Context is key. And I think that like what I was finding, as an activist and a blogger trying to have these conversations, is I'd often get, oh, that's an American problem, like we don't really have that here, so I don't know why you're complaining. But I knew that wasn't the case. At least, it wasn't something I learned on my curriculum at school, but I knew anecdotally from older black people around me that there had been some serious mistreatment just one generation before I was born. And so I made it my mission. Also, I'm a journalist, so that's important to mention, because one thing that, if you're talking about an issue as a journalist and you're writing for a paper or anything, you have to kind of provide some big picture analysis about the phenomenon that's happening. So for me, it was very important to provide that context. And I think that like something that I came across in activist circles a lot was conversations, particularly from the older generation, talking about young people of colour not knowing their history, not knowing where they came from, blah blah blah, and almost a sort of that it was a suggestion that it was our responsibility, or that knowledge wasn't being passed down. But I also knew that on my curriculum at school I'd only learnt about Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks and things in an American context, and I always heard people complaining, oh, we don't know our history, we don't know our history. So I was like, okay, let me just do that, like, rather than complaining about us not knowing our history, let me just find it. So I spent a lot of time in the British Library and the Black Cultural Archives in Brixton, just going through, old books and like archived material, and it wasn't hard to find. But it wasn't difficult to access. The only issue was that it hadn't been reproduced in the narrative of the country, like reproduced as the story of Britain in the same way that the other historical narratives had. And that's why it was like written out, Do
you think that's the reason in sort of British curriculum it's people seem more comfortable talking about, for example, the civil rights movement in the United States than Black British history, is because of the distance? Because if we were to engage with some of the history that you talk about in the book, it would pose a lot of difficult questions that people didn't want to face.
It's probably some self-reflection, which Britain doesn't like to do that much, rather just shout about how, colonialism was actually amazing. So, yes, it would probably prompt too much self-reflection. I mean, I don't know. I have not had direct conversations with people who set Britain's national curriculum, but it seems to me that there's a deep unwillingness. But not only, the thing is, this gets reproduced generation after generation, so it's not like one day somebody knew and then decided not to write it down. Sure. It's like one generation of kids doesn't learn it, so they don't know, and then they go off to be teachers, and they haven't learned it, and then they teach kids who don't know, and so I was like, also I think while I was researching for that portion of the book, I was thinking, am I doing the right thing by collating these like fairly easily accessible historical documents, and also getting in touch with people who were doing work around civil rights in Britain in the 70s and 80s. And then I thought, it's not, these people are still alive. The documents are very easy to access, but it's never been put in front of people before.
And one of the people you spoke to, so Linda Bellos, who the founder, I guess, the creator of Black History Month,
alongside
in the UK,
alongside another chap as well. Yeah, they founded it during the 1980s, in the sort of like radical labour movement. Yeah,
and in one of the quotations you have from her, we said it's a slight frustration on her part. She said, they don't know why we're in this country. And then she precises it wasn't about hair, it was History Month, not Culture Month. And it did make me think that in Britain it does seem like culture is something that we seem very comfortable talking about. So, we have the Notting Hill Carnival, and we could talk about the chicken tikka masala as the national dish. But the sort of there's that willingness to embrace one side of it without the same willingness, it seems, to engage with the history that led to these different cultures being in the UK. And that seemed, when I was reading your book, it seemed to be a kind of a disconnect in the national psyche in a way.
Yes, absolutely. And again, I think it's just like a reluctance to prompt any sort of self-reflection, which is a bit weird to me, because I think like other countries in the global north are fairly all right at like looking at their own histories of discrimination and oppression, Germany, for example. The US is slowly making progress on that front. At least one half of it is. So it seems very, it's nice to talk about everyone having fun and eating food and enjoying each other and going to Notting Hill Carnival, and there's a white policeman dancing. Like, that's
the same photo published every year.
Yeah, exactly. But like, there's very little discussion about the struggle that actually led to Notting Hill Carnival in the first place. And I just feel like really it's a metaphor for life. Like, you can't just take the good bits without actually looking at the struggle that, that's why people have therapists, literal individuals have therapists, because if you try to just like ignore and repress the difficult like emotions, whether individually or nationally, you're going to have some problems. So yeah, that was a deep frustration for me, and I think for her as well.
And it also seemed that, like, I think one of the other reasons that it's vital to know this history is that it avoids repeating the same mistakes in a way, in as much as there's a moment when you talk about the case with Robert Relf, who put up a sign saying he would only sell his house to English people.
And by that he meant white ones.
Indeed.
Yes.
And you talk about how this kind of led to a media campaign against political correctness, and that was sort of the seed of this idea that political correctness was in some way ridiculous or in some way destructive. And it struck me that there's a similar sort of dynamic going on at the moment with terms like intersectionality or safe spaces. There seems to be this concerted attempt in the media to sort of to undermine these terms. And I wonder sort of if people were more familiar of, for example, how the media sought to undermine political correctness, then perhaps it would be harder for the same tactics to work again.
Yeah, I mean, political correctness is not a phrasing I use, but when that drum was being banged in the 60s and 70s, and then, I looked through the archive material and saw what the papers were angry at, it was a man they were rallying around a man who was trying to operate a discriminatory housing policy, and the local government said, you can't do that, because what he was doing was illegal. So, like, isn't that just like being kind to one another? Like, I don't understand any media campaign for cruelty between human beings myself, but I guess I'm not a newspaper editor, so I don't understand. I guess I don't understand the bottom line to sell papers. But one thing that I was going to say in terms of like reckoning with history is, if you don't really engage with what happened just one generation previously, or even two generations previously, not only are you doomed to make the same mistakes, but I'm reminded of a quote in the book that I quoted the director of the Institute of Race Relations in the UK. His name is Ambalamvana Sivanandan, and he said, "We are here because you were there." And he said that about Britain's immigrant experience, but not just immigrants, because I really do think that's a lazy term in this context, because we're talking about people who are now second, third generations. These are naturalized British people, including myself. And I think that phrasing, "we are here because you are there, you were there," is so important. And unless, you know, the country really reckons with what the "you were there" meant, like Britain literally went to these countries, you know, and said, "Okay, this is ours now." Like, unless there's a widespread understanding of what that means, then you're going to constantly have these conversations about, "Oh, where have all these people come from?" You know, in the book, I discussed the fact that in the 50s and 60s, Jamaicans were turning up on British shores because Britain was a mother country. You know. So it seems absurd just 20 years later that they were being treated so abhorrently by the police, who were acting as an arm of the British state. You were there, and I think that's so important. That's a context that I think is not passed down, not taught. It's deeply frustrating, but I hope that more people understand what that's been like. You know, not just reading the book, but also in the bibliography of the book, I point towards the UK historian Stephen Bourne. He's a self-taught historian who's done loads of work around this. So, but I also feel like the onus can't just be each individual has to become educated. Like, there needs to be a bit more of a widespread understanding of what the "you were there" actually meant. It means the global North's colonialism project.
Indeed. And in fact, that sort of the onus being on sort of the responsibility of the individual compared to the responsibility of the system, I think that brings us kind of quite nicely onto one of the sort of the central cruxes of the book, is this concept of structural racism, which variously, I mean, you prefer the term structural to institutional, because if I understood correctly, structural takes in society wider than sort of specific institutions.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's been some questions about whether why I chose structural. I don't wish to quibble. You know, if you understand institutional more easily, fine. But for me, it was just like, I want to say structures because I think anything can be a structure. Like, there's a family structure, there can be a friendship group structure, there can be your workplace, small or large. It can also be the National Health Service, the police, the education system, whatever. So I don't wish to quibble on that.
And the concept of structural racism, let's say, for let's just, if anybody in the audience who has not yet read the book, who isn't quite aware of what structural racism might be, would you be able to give us a sort of a quick
maybe I should just do a reading from the book. That would be better.
Oh, that would be great. Yeah,
I'm better in the written word. Okay, let's see. Actually, no, this is quite a long explanation in the book. So what I really talk about in this chapter, the system, is the fact that because there is a wealth of data about demographics and wealth and opportunity and inequality in Britain, it's really easy to look at the numbers and see who's being held back, or let's say what groups. I use that term loosely because we know that not everybody who perhaps share the same skin colour even mentally consider themselves as part of a group, but rather like, what groups are being discriminated against, basically. So what I did, I just looked at this data, from higher education, like umbrella bodies and education umbrella bodies, healthcare, the criminal justice system, etc., etc., etc. And I basically just looked at race and opportunity, and I found repeatedly over and over again, if you were not white, your life chances were impeded by that fact. And it wasn't always just a question of poverty as well, because the demographics and the numbers and the stats in the UK shows us that if you are not white, you are far more likely to be working class than if you are white. And that's not to say that white people are not also living in poverty in Britain. It's just that the working class, that group is overwhelmingly populated by people who are not white. And that's also not to say that there is not a thriving black middle class. It's just far smaller. So I found stats that basically showed that black boys were far more likely to be excluded from school, in the primary school system than their white counterparts. When it came to the year 6 SATs, so that's like 11-year-olds taking their exams to get into secondary school, black children were being undermarked by their own teachers when it came to those exams, and that was actually something that was rectified by anonymous marking. I found that when it came to higher education, so university, black students were far more likely to get a lower grade than their white counterparts. Then when you leave university, people with African and Asian sounding names, and this was a report done by the government's Department for Work and Pensions in 2009, people with African and Asian sounding names applying for jobs alongside people with white British sounding names. And for all intents and purposes, these people have got this similar qualifications and experience, were far less likely to be called to a job interview than people with white British sounding names. And, repeatedly I kept finding when looking at the data that if you were not white, or sometimes even perceived to be not white, in terms of that names situation, your life chances were impeded. And I sort of thought, okay, so there has to be one of two explanations for this, especially when you account for, we also know it's not simply to do with race. There's going to be some economic inequality mixed up in there as well, particularly given the fact that if you're not white, you're more likely to be poor in Britain, right? But I was like, okay, so it's either that these people whose life chances are impeded are either just inherently inferior, and that's why their life chances, that's why they're being discriminated at every point, or there is some broad discrimination here happening, and I don't think it's as simple as saying, okay, so particularly in that job situation where with CVs, it's not KKK members reading the CVs, right? Like it's not actually an overt hatred type of racism, but there's clearly some bias there, and that's what I really meant by structural racism. And
this in a way goes kind of radically against the story Britain has been telling itself, at least over the last 30-40 years, of the sort of essentially being a meritocracy. And it seems, as you say, because obviously you have these one of two options, and people who subscribe to the meritocracy idea can't essentially accept the structural idea, because it completely undermines
I'm
that
sure
approach.
It's both. I'm now doing a veritably middle class profession. I know lots of people of colour in middle class professions who are excellent at what they do, but they still feel like they probably would have gone further if their name didn't look a little bit foreign on the CV. And, at the same time with meritocracy, yes, of course, hard work matters. And I'm not saying here that because of structural racism, hard work doesn't matter. Of course it does. Yeah. But what the injustice is, the people who work hard and their external factors that are impeding their potential and their progress, and that's what I'm annoyed about. Of course hard work matters, and I think that particularly these conversations about meritocracy and positive action and stuff, one of the refrains you'll always get is, oh well, you want unqualified people to do that, you want a quota and those people won't be qualified. And I'm like, I just know so many people, particularly in the creative industries, who are wildly qualified and not getting the opportunities that they deserve. And I think that the issue here with those external factors that are impeding people's potential is that if you are discriminating consciously or unconsciously on race, you're actually allowing some mediocrity into the net. And I just don't believe, even though I look at Britain's creative and industries and political industries and I look at the people who like hold positions of power in Britain, and I see that they're all white and male and middle-aged, I just don't believe that the only people who are talented in that country are white and male and middle-aged. I refuse to believe it. I know it's not true.
There seems to be kind of a level of denial. I mean, there was one moment where you quote somebody from who does sort of a study on racial prejudice in British business at the top, the top levels of British business, and you quote some statistics, which basically say, as you say, it's almost exclusively white, male, middle-aged, and this guy says, there's little sign of systemic racial prejudice at the top of British business. We've investigated, and there's little sign, seeming to deny the fact that the statistics they should be the sign that he needs in a way. Like it seems. There seems to be a level of cognitive dissonance there that sort of statistically this is no way representative of society. But we've done our study and we can't find any prejudice. Therefore, it's not prejudice.
I think it's frustrating for me as a writer and a journalist because, I studied my English literature. I read the canon. I paid attention to every philosopher, great mind, and I would say that white men have often been seen as the arbiter of logical, rational thinking. Okay, cool. But then there are incidences like that one in which he can't see the wood for the trees. He cannot see, it's like he can't see the water around him. And that's frustrating because, logical, rational, objective. No, I'm a journalist. I love objectivity. I love to look for the truth. And I think it's frustrating for me where you can see somebody's bias creeping in, which is actually stopping them from reaching what the evidence shows them, right? And as an activist, I think I was always put in a position where I had to provide evidence, and that's part of the reason I became a journalist, right? So I did that. Yeah. And it's frustrating that there are still some people who refuse to look at that evidence. But
that's it, really, I guess, isn't it? At the heart of it, that not being able to see the wood for the trees. It's a sort of like because of the way that British society has been structured for so long, there's no need there has been no need for white people generally, and probably white men in particular, to recognise this, because there's always been. I mean, there's a moment where you say neutral is white, the default is white. So if you're brought up with this idea of yourself as the neutral, it's almost like you've sort of been denied the tools to see the wood for the trees.
Indeed, and I think it's kind of a double think. And there's also a point in the book where I talk about a real disparity that I know, at least anecdotally, to be true, which is that I know that when I was growing up in South London, I was told by my mum, look, you're always going to have to work twice as hard as your white counterparts if you want to get on in life. And meanwhile, my white friends were being told by their parents, everyone's equal, everyone's the same, it's fine. So we've got two different messages going there, and that's very concerning.
And in fact, you talk about this idea of colour blindness, which I mean, I think myself, I was brought up with this idea, and I think my parents were probably very well-meaning in doing so. But I think it's a very interesting perspective you have on that. It's sort of like this. It's not useful. In fact, it's in some way it's going to be an impediment to a just society.
Yes, of course. And I think that if you believe in fair play, then why would you not base your stance on this, A, on the evidence, and then B, work towards a place in which we are fair? I'm not anti-meritocracy. I love the idea of meritocracy. That's why I'm an anti-racist, because I see that it's a point in the future we need to get to, and unless we deal with discrimination, we're not going to have one. It's very sort of interesting, I think, for me to be speaking here, because, for me, it was the idea of collecting the evidence and the data was so important, and it's very interesting to be speaking in a country where collecting the evidence and the data is literally illegal. And I don't know, am I going to get arrested when I leave here? But yeah, it's I wholeheartedly believe in fair play. I think everybody should have the potential to start on a level playing ground, but the evidence shows that we're not there. We are not there yet. So let's just be honest about it. We're not perfect as individuals or as nation states. So why lie about it?
And that's one thing that you do constantly throughout the book. Actually, is the sort of the the recognition of the complexity of the situation. And in fact, you even say, I mean, you talk about, I think it's in the new chapter in Aftermath, where you talk about giving a talk at a school, and somebody in the audience, a white lady, asked you, what can we, what's the end point? And the young lady afterwards said, I think people who are looking for an end point are sort of refusing to recognize the complexity and the difficulty of the situation. They just kind of want rid of it, in fact. And that's the thing. This is not a book of easy solutions. It's not a book of sort of
but people love to ask me for easy solutions, so don't do that today, because I will not answer your question.
And in fact, and I recognize this, I will come to questions from the audience soon, because I could go on for hours, and I have to discipline myself. But a couple of things I do want to talk about before. Firstly, one of the most, there's not many surreal moments in this book, but one is where you interview Nick Griffin.
Oh, yes.
So for anybody who's not British here, Nick Griffin was essentially the leader of the British National Party, which was the British National Front. And it's quite an experience, I think, as a reader, sort of running up against his words in the middle of yours, in fact. And I just wondered, could you just talk a little bit about the experience of, firstly, why you decided to include this interview, and what it was actually like for you to
Well, I was mentioning him and his political ideology from about 10 years ago, and then my editor was like, you should probably just get in touch with him to make sure that what you're saying is correct, because we don't want to get sued.
Yeah.
So I said, okay, I'll do that. And then I was like, I recorded the conversation, and obviously he knew I was a journalist. I was able to get in touch with him because one of the editors I work with in a journalistic capacity wrote a book about the BNP a few years back as well, so I just wrote to him. Anyway, we had the conversation. Well, first I said, you're welcome to speak to me in the London offices of my publisher, and then he said, I don't like to go to London because it's a foreign country. So anyway, so the conversation was so weird, but also I felt that it needed to go into the book in full, somewhat contradicting the title. But also I think that, in the age of some narratives that are happening around Brexit and Trump about, what I call in the book, a fear of a black planet, demographic change and stuff, I just wanted to remind people where those ideas came from. And I think that he did a fantastic job of reminding everybody where those ideas came from. And all the news coverage, I think particularly around Trump's election, around certain demographics called the white working class, which I believe is a fallacious demographic, because, the evidence shows that the working class is as much brown and black as it is white, are scared of demographic change and scared about their sense of self changing and being under threat. And that was being parroted on national news channels as a reason why Trump was elected. So my conversation with Nick Griffin, the far-right former political leader, really did just get us back to the origins of that narrative, I think. So I just want people to remember what they're parroting when they're saying that.
It's a very curious thing, that phrase, white working class, because I remember growing up in Britain in the 80s and 90s, and class was the last thing you were allowed to talk about. This was a moment when, you would have a Labour leader who had been very expensively privately educated, or obviously with the Conservative government later on, who all went to some of the most expensive schools in the country. And if you brought up class, you were told, well, how dare you? Because how could you say that just because he's incredibly rich, he can't understand the problems on the council estate?
He can't. Being incredibly rich, how can he?
And yet, fascinatingly, over the last few years, as you point out, that sort of when it comes to playing this new game of divide and rule, essentially, when it kind of is suddenly useful for the political class to talk about this concept of the working class again, suddenly it becomes a sort of a political buzzword, and it's okay
of course
to talk about.
And I think that where Britain gained in conversations about race in the mid-90s, around the time of the Stephen Lawrence inquiry and the Macpherson report and all of that stuff, what it lacked was really just stating the truth, which is that this is an issue of race and class. So there have been supposedly anti-racist narratives that have left class out of the equation, which I just don't think is sufficient enough. And that's why there's a whole chapter in the book about race and class and housing, in particular, in the London borough that I grew up in Tottenham, in Haringey. And it just gives you an idea of who's actually losing out. Who's literally on the ground losing out from from the class narrative. And, you know, one thing I say in the book is we've got this conceptualization of a working class person being, you know, a stocky northern white man in a flat cap, when actually I think it's closer to a black woman in London, a single mum pushing a buggy. You know, that's what the evidence shows us. So we can't not integrate those things. They are, I'm not going to say they're one and the same, but they're so closely intertwined.
And indeed, the other sort of big chapter that comes towards the end, comes before the one on class, but is the chapter on feminism as well. And I really will turn over to the audience in a moment. But I just thought it was fascinating the way you construct your argument throughout the book, and the way you present your ideas, because it becomes really a clarion call for justice. In as much as I think, you know, it becomes very clear from your arguments that you cannot, for example, really be a feminist if you're not anti-racist. You can't be a class warrior if you're not anti-racist. You can't be anti-racist if you're not also a feminist and a class warrior. Like these are all sort of inseparable concepts, in fact.
Yes, indeed. And I think that each movement fails when it doesn't take those things into account. And obviously, like my chapter on feminism, which was actually the first chapter I wrote, I don't know if anybody can tell on reading that, I was pretty annoyed. I think that the feminist movement in Britain, you know, between like 2012 and 2015, it made some wins, but for whom? I mean, okay, we've got some fairly thoughtful media representation of white, middle class, slim ladies. Okay. I don't know, I just feel like that's not exciting me. So, yeah. We really need some progress on that front.
Okay, it is over to you now. Now, one thing I just want to say is, look, we're talking, and I noticed something Reni wrote a while ago, saying sort of a lot of people sometimes they'll come with questions, and our first response is, well, read the book and then ask me a question. So what we would quite like to do is prioritise questions from members of the audience who have read the book and would like to ask a question specifically about the book. So we're going to get a microphone to you, because there are people everywhere. They're upstairs, they're outside, so please do wait for the microphone to get to you before you ask your question. And also please make it as brief as possible so we can get through as many as possible. With all of that said, please raise your hand if you would like to ask a question.
Well, ask a vague question, but
okay. Well, we'll start. We'll run the microphone. Okay, we'll run the microphone to you then. We'll bring it to this lady afterwards.
Oh, maybe we were asking too much. I don't know.
Thank you. Good evening. I have a very well-developed question, and it's quick, I promise. So, a few days ago, a right-wing French newspaper, Valeurs Actuelles, which means current values, published an issue that claimed to showcase the positive side of colonies. At the same time, it was revealed that a will to remind the positive impact of colonization was actually carried out by the state, the French state, internally for now. From a British black point of view, where does France stand on the question of race and reparations? I don't know if I say that well. And what advice would you give to your French peers in response to that? Thank you. Okay,
that's an interesting question. I've got to be honest with you. I've been in the country for about 12 hours, so I'm not going to be able to speak with any real consideration. Also, I can't read French, so... but... It seems, I'm not going to say we can't talk, that there's absolutely no positive benefits to colonisation. For example, me, as a British person, let's say first and foremost, I hugely benefit from being a passport holder of a country that tried to take over the world. So basically anywhere I go, people can understand me. I individually benefit in that stance. But I think that you cannot have a one-sided conversation about the positives without discussing the negatives. And I do believe that the conversation has become so polarized that the far right are like, let's just talk about the positives. I mean, we have to sort of remember the point of the far right as well. And I think that white supremacy at large and white nationalism, like the whole point of that political movement, I mean, it was born out of defending and justifying the right to own people. So I just don't think I'm going to be looking to them for a really well-rounded, nuanced conversation about this. And I feel like there needs to be, first of all, an absolute excavation of the real impact, which was overwhelmingly negative, before we can talk about, oh yes, culture exchange and language and all of those things. So that's what I'd say there. And I don't really trust the far right to do that excavation, because their agenda is really about continuing to try and justify white supremacy. So yeah, they're pretty clear about that one.
Hi, so my name's Amy. I'm an American. I've been living in France for about 5 years. I did read your book. Thank you so much. There's one, so I've been living here, and about a year ago I started getting involved in anti-racism work here, and that's really when, particularly with white French people, I read your blog around the same time and was trying to have conversations with white French people and found it so exasperating and so hard. I thought I would have so much more patience. I did not. And it got to the point where I basically started avoiding my white French friends, because I was like, oh my God, if this topic comes up, I'm just going to lose so much respect for them, because they're going to say such clumsy, awkward, and terrible things. So my question for you is very personal, given that your blog post was originally personal. I imagine after the publication of your book, there are white acquaintances, friends, people in your circles and networks who have wanted to have maybe one-on-one conversations with you about this. And I imagine that must be exhausting. How do you navigate that? Because for me, it's gotten to the point where I have a Google Doc that's entitled Resources for White French People. And I'm like, this conversation is really exhausting. I mean, can you read this first, or check this out first, and then we can have a conversation. But I just can't, spread myself thin trying to, and so.
That's an interesting question. My white friends, acquaintances, and in some case family members have not done that to me. Of course, I think they know where I stand on this. I'm quite an introverted person, so this is an interesting environment for me. I already feel overwhelmed, and I think that I've also I'm at this sort of stage of my life now where I would like to think that I'm around people who really care about my well-being, so they know that don't drain Reni's personal energy, perhaps aggressively questioning her about something that she's been spending the best part of a decade working on and has written about 80,000 words on. If you really, really want to know what she's got to say, right, read the book. I mean, that's part of the reason I wrote the book. Now, I recognise that's not a solution for everyone, which is why I'm still very an advocate for drawing boundaries, and it's a difficult one. You just hope that if these people who you're speaking of actually care about you as a person, that they will be, even if they don't understand, they will recognize that they may be personally draining you, and know that there are resources that they can read that don't require to back you into a corner at a party saying justify this, justify that. And I just think that that's just basic human decency and manners. And I think that anybody who doesn't understand that and sees and believes that they are entitled to back you into a corner, doesn't have basic decency or manners. That's what I think. For me, yes, this is my job now. But when I wrote that piece, it was self-expression. I think that you're allowed to say, wow, the state of the world is really bugging me today. without them being seen as the advocate who has to answer on this forever. And you are the person, you are the symbol, and every white person in your like immediate vicinity is going to be like, oh, here's an article. Let me go to you to discuss it, discuss this, tell me, prove to me. Like, you're not the encyclopedia, you're not the dictionary, you're not Google. You don't have to do that. You're allowed to draw boundaries. And I would hope, I mean, it's the same with feminism as well. You know, certain men will be like, start sending you links. Oh, what do you think about this as a feminist? Well, what I think is that I'm not a vending machine of opinions. So you're allowed to draw boundaries. And if those people are truly care for your well-being, they'll understand those boundaries. And if they don't truly care for your well-being.
Thank you. There's a question back here.
Sure, thank you. Hi, thanks for coming. I actually have a question about the differences, your opinion on the differences in the Black experience, in the sense, not that I'm asking you to speak for all Black British people, but your personal opinion on the different debates that folks have about, you know, like I'm an American, for example, you're British, French Black people are here, lots of different ethnicities of Black people are here, but this idea that one person's experience should be considered more than another person's experience. And I'm actually kind of asking, I know this isn't really to do with your book, even though I did read it, but I'm just thinking about the movie Get Out and how in that film, Daniel Kaluuya, who's from London and he's Black, he was cast in a role that was originally meant for an African American, and Samuel L. Jackson had a problem with it because he said British people have been interracially dating since the 1800s. So that was his justification for that. And
but then didn't the Notting Hill riots start in the 60s because there was a mixed race couple at a tube station?
It was completely
turned into a riot.
Exactly.
That was less than 100 years ago. So
right, and so. Just wondering what you think about it's actually about how Black people from different backgrounds can connect and relate to each other. That's my question, and I'd love to know your thoughts about it. Thank you.
I think the one thing that sort of needs to be remembered here is that we are still products of the global north, even though you may not be white, you're still a product of the global north. So, for example, Samuel Jackson's point sounded to me to be coming from a place of American dominance rather than like any Black solidarity, and not there didn't appear to be a developed understanding of how like American culture dominates most of the world. So like. And that's part of the reason why I wanted to situate this book really squarely in Britain, because I was tired of American narratives. Also, speaking to actor and actress friends in Britain, they tell me that if they want to have a career, they have to go to the US because the UK industry is so covertly and pervasively discriminatory that they're just not going to find the work. So I think if it was coming from a place of like people of colour solidarity, he would have recognised that and celebrated that Daniel Kaluuya got that role. But I think it speaks to a broader problem that some African Americans are guilty of perpetuating, which is just forgetting that they are African American. Okay, so yeah, there's massive history of oppression there, but they're also American. And that's something that needs to be remembered. Much like I know that I'm living in a country that tried to take over the world, but I'm also British. Like, do I realise the privilege that gives me? Like, I know it for that British passport. Makes my life easy anywhere in the world I go. So, and I think that really needs to be reckoned with, and that's why I think the conversation has to be nuanced enough to take into account all of those facets, and that's why I'm increasingly in my work talking about the global north as well. I can't say that my life and experience as a Black woman growing up primarily in Britain, albeit a working class upbringing, in a country with a welfare state, meaning that we were never in dire extreme straits. I can't say that's the same as a black woman from South Sudan, or a Bangladeshi woman who, you know, maybe got caught up in the Rana Plaza disaster making clothes for H&M, so I can go and spend £30 and get a new outfit on my local high street. No, I have to recognise what my structural, like, privilege as a person over the living in the global north means for the rest of the world. So I think that that's a conversation that's sorely lacking currently from anti-racist conversations in the global north. And I'm talking about, you know, Europe, in which I include the UK, America, and also sort of, yes, I do. Also America and like Australia, New Zealand, and Canada. Yeah.
Okay. There's one back there. If the person would like to come forward so we can see you, that'd be great.
Hi.
Hello.
So nice to finally see you. I've been waiting for this for forever.
Oh, well, hope I don't disappoint.
No, you didn't. Actually, I have two questions, but it's going to blend into one. As a girl coming from the Caribbean, I'm from Barbados. My history is obviously just a little bit different to somebody who lived in America or somebody who is from the UK, for example. We actually were raised to learn our history, and obviously our situation was much different. We lived with 90% people on the island who were black, with probably 5% or 8% white, and then 3% of another race. So my question, the first one would be, how do you recommend for someone moving to a country which is they're not the majority like me? I'm completely shocked to experience certain things regarding my race, like things that I would not have expected to happen have happened, although I might have been warned by my parents, like, it's different, you should really, you know, keep your head on, because, you know, we in the Caribbean are very, very hot-headed. Naturally, Jamaicans are the ones who have the reputation for being the most hot-headed, and I'm so sorry to know that, because, you know, that's just how we are. But how do we not get angry, and how do we air our grievances and find other people like us to air those grievances too? Like, how do we find a small community in another country that we are not used to? Even after a year, we're still not used to it. We still don't know everyone. So how do we find, and how do we go about, you know, being together and, you know, expressing ourselves? Because, you know, no matter how much we express it to other people, they're not going to get it, because they're not us. They don't have our experiences. And as much as they say, yeah, you know, I understand, like, you know, it's like, you don't understand. So how do you
Okay, so I think that's a really interesting question. So my heritage is Nigerian. I mean, I've never lived there, but I speak to people who have lives, who are also British and Nigerian, have lives much closer to Nigeria. So, for example, the Nigerian gay rights activist Bisi Alimi, who moved to the UK after he had to seek asylum when he came out on Nigerian television at a time when society there was wildly homophobic. I mean, it's still homophobic, but it was really, really bad back then. And he says something similar to what the author Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, who I did an event with a few weeks back, also said, which was that when she moved to America and when BC moved to Britain, he became black. So suddenly there's all of this, like, nuance that they're having to deal with. And, you know, coming from, let's say, a majority black country, you're like, huh, what? So I have never experienced suddenly having a weight of racial history thrust upon me as I get off a plane, because I've always lived in Britain, so I can't 100% empathise with that experience. It's a soup that I've grown up in. So what I have done with my frustrations of, let's say, that soup, this is a very bad analogy now, is attempt to try and channel it into some sort of form of creativity. I think particularly when I've been surrounded by people who not only don't understand but feel committed, they appeared committed to misunderstanding me. I found it was important to sort of channel it into creativity, and that's what this book was. But also, I wasn't totally alone. I was surrounded by people who did get it, and I sought that through activist groups and people who recognised there was a problem and working on anti-racism. And I imagine in this room and in this bookshop and outside, there are almost certainly going to be some people who are working on these issues, and you should speak to them. For example, this young woman who said that she's involved. And I think that is just... sometimes the activism isn't going out and doing something that catches attention. Rather, it's just a space of catharsis where you can get together and be like, wow, this happened to me today, and I know I can't talk to my housemates about it because they're not going to understand. And so that's what I would suggest.
We are going to have to finish there, I'm afraid. We've already run over. Reni will be signing books here. I'm just going to give you some quick directions for the signing, because there are a lot of you and I think it's going to get quite chaotic quite quickly. So the books are available at the front there, unless you already have it. If you do already have it, or if you're going to join the signing queue, what we're going to ask you to do is to loop behind us here. That'll take you around there, and the front of the signing queue will just be under this archway. We will also be serving wine afterwards. We'll be playing music, so do stick around. The evening is not over yet. And please to join me one more time in saying thank you so much to Reni Eddo-Lodge. Thank you.
Thanks for coming. Thanks for turning out, everyone. Much appreciated.